there's two questions here that we have to kind of distinguish. One is the question of how much did Imam Abu Hanifah narrate? And the second question is, what's his grading as a hadith narrator? If I approach the madhab, and let's say, like, I don't have the tools of ijtihad, nor do I claim it, right? But let's say I do claim it. I say I'm mujtahid now. Even though I'm Hanafi, brought up, etc. And I approach a book and I start doing complete, so I say, Imam Shafi is right here. He got this wrong. Imam Ahmed is right here. And this is what I do. I might still a Hanafi. The purpose of these collections, for most people are reading it, is saying, what did Imam Abu Hanifah narrate?
Yeah.
So the maqsad of the editor, the maqsad of the book itself is just do ithbat of that to Imam Abu Hanifah. We may ask this question as well, is that how did this guy, or some of us like we come now, how are we correcting the likes of Zayla'i, Ibn Hajar? How can you put my name or anyone's name today with these guys?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salawatu wa salam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. Welcome to part 2 of episode 1, because we're giving you extra content. And barakallahu feek. Now, some of the books that we're going to discuss last week, which we're going to discuss this week, are the Masanid of al-Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah, published by Lateef al-Rahman al-Bahraiji, and the new publication of Molana Yusuf Shabir's work, which is al-Inayah, to do with the book al-Hidayah, which I'll let Molana explain in a bit. So let's just start with the Masanid of al-Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah. Molana, what is this book? Why do we need it? What does it entail in it? And what did the muhaqqiq set out to do with this work?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmadu salli wa nusallim ala rasulihil kareem. Amma ba'd. So this book, which is, he actually entitles it as the al-Mawsu'ah al-Hadithiyah, Marwiyat al-Imam Abu Hanifah. Although we can say the word Masanid Abu Hanifah, but it's something more broad than that, because the Masanid are books that were written after the demise of Imam Abu Hanifah. So just a few points to clarify is that Imam Abu Hanifah never wrote a book of hadith except the debate regarding Kitab al-Athar. So the Kitab al-Athar, which is written by Imam Muhammad, and the other one by Imam Abu Yusuf, there is a debate whether this is actually a transmission of the book of Kitab al-Athar or Imam Abu Hanifah. Beyond that debate, right, whichever side you want to take, there is no Musnad work or hadith book that Imam Abu Hanifah compiled that we are aware of. So when we hear of a book called Musnad Imam Abu Hanifah, that's going to be a later scholar gathering the hadith of Imam Abu Hanifah in one place, right? And this work is, so the Masanid are these kind of books. So this book, what he tries to do, Molana Lateef al-Rahman Bahraiji, who's alive, he's alive and well. And so he's published, a lot of his books actually coming out now. So he's working on it for a number of years. They're getting published. His Sharmani Athar has come out now. Some years back, he published the Musnad Tahawi, which was him gathering all the hadith of Imam Tahawi together. Many years back, actually, he had a defense of the Fadali Amal of Molana Zakaria Kandeli rahimahullah, and that was in Arabic. He's published the Masanid Imam Hanifah separately. So he's got the Musnad Imam A'adham of al-Harithi, he's published in 2 volumes. The Musnad Ibn Khusraw, which is published in 2 volumes. He just published recently the Musnad of Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani. So a number of these works have come out of his. And there's some that are still coming out. This book, the Mawsu'ah, is basically a combination of all the effort he's done by gathering all these hadith of Imam Abu Hanifah and these kind of secondary literature, as well as other books, of course the Kitab al-Athar as well, as well as other books of hadith in which Imam Abu Hanifah's hadith may be there. That's why he's entitled as a Mawsu'ah al-Hadithi rather than Masanid. So it's not just gathered from the Masanid, it's more broader than that. So he's gathered all that he could find in terms of the ahadith of Imam Abu Hanifah in one place. And so because he's been working at it for a number of years, this is the combination of, some decades effort when we get to this Mawsu'ah.
So this Mawsu'ah, this compilation, this work that's supposed to be comprehensive of the athar and the ahadith of that has been narrated supposedly by al-Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah. Has anyone done any work before this?
So the most famous book historically, right, was a book written by, which is called Jami al-Masanid by Imam Khawarizmi. So this Jami al-Masanid was a collection of all the Masanid that Imam al-Khawarizmi could get access to, or what we believe he could get access to. And so what he does, and he's got an introduction to this book and it's published, right? And then it was republished by Sheikh Lateef Rahman Bahraiji, I think last year, the year before that. So what he does in this book, Imam Khawarizmi, is that he goes through 15 Masanid that he could get hold of. And the purpose behind this was, he goes that people were making this, he heard people make this claim that Imam al-Shafi'i's got a book of hadith, right? Or he's got many hadith. Imam Malik's got the Muwatta, Imam Ahmed's got the Musnad, and Imam Abu Hanifah doesn't have anything. So he goes, when I saw this, I got very upset. And he says, this Nu'mani fanaticism took over. This kind of passion to defend the madhab, it took over. And so I gathered the 15 Masanid together and organized them into abwab. And so that was historically one of the main efforts that was done to collect the ahadith of Imam Hanifah. In the Muqaddimah to this book, this is the Mawsu'ah. So this book of Molana Lateef from Bahraiji is in 18 volumes, right? So it's 18 volumes, so it's far larger than anything that he's done before. And the first few volumes, he has a number of different discussions he takes on, which is not directly related to the collection itself. So he's got a response to Ibn Abi Shayba,
in the
the Rad of Imam Hanifah, which comes in Musnad of Ibn Abi Shayba. He's got a response to that. He's also got, he also talks about some of the background to this book as well. So he talks about certain efforts that were done in the subcontinent in trying to gather the hadith of Abu Hanifah, but they never complete. And this was like the dream of his Sheikh Molana Abdul Rashid Nu'mani, rahimahullah, who was a very famous scholar in Pakistan, in Karachi, who wrote the famous book Al-Imam Ibn Majah wa Kitabu Sunan, and numerous other books. So he was very much a known defender of the madhab. He kind of made that his effort and goal. So he wanted a book like this. And so no one was able to kind of fully do it until he's made this collection. Right? So this is some of the background to the work. But in terms of in the past, other than Jami' al-Asanid of Imam Khawarizmi, there isn't anything else in that comprehensive way of trying to gather the hadith of Imam Hanifah together.
There is a modern study that was done on trying to look at what a hadith marfu', the Prophet ﷺ said that, which that Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah has narrated. Now this study came to a conclusion that was far less than 18 volumes.
Yeah.
It's about 17 hadith or
70
ahadith.
70, about approximately 70.
70 ahadith. So now that, how does that stack up compared to this Mawsu'ah?
So there's a couple of things here. So there's two questions here that we have to kind of distinguish. One is the question of how much did Imam Abu Hanifah narrate? And the second question is, what's his grading as a hadith narrator? So we don't want to mix those 2 points up, right? So a person can sometimes only narrate a few hadith and be thiqa, and a person can be an imam hafiz but be da'if.
Yes.
Right? There's examples of both. So there's two separate discussions. So if, for example, someone was to prove that Imam Abu Hanifah had only little hadith that he narrated, right? All that shows is that he was narrating little. That doesn't show he knew less hadith. It just means that he narrated little hadith.
Yes.
And then that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be thiqa in hadith, right? So these are kind of separate points that we have to clarify. Where a lot of times a person sometimes feels that I need to prove that Imam Abu Hanifah has thousands of hadith, and if I can prove that, that shows that he is trustworthy.
Reliability is not contingent on the amount of ahadith you narrate.
So that's an important distinction to make. So, and the Hanafis, by the way, were kind of aware of this. The Hanafis, when they discussed this issue of Imam Hanifah and how much he transmitted, they would make a distinction. So some Hanafis were okay with that. They said, yeah, he narrated little hadith because his conditions were strict or whatever, or he's engaged in fiqh. They had these kind of explanations. Whereas others like Imam Khawarizmi, and what kind of the logic behind this book is that, no, he wasn't. He actually transmitted a lot of hadith. So so this is kind of, it tries to refute that notion. But back to the point, this is I think you're referring to the book Al-Imam Abu Hanifah Bayn al-Jarh wa Ta'deel, which is a master's dissertation done, I think, in the 70s in Al-Quran University. So this book, what it tries to do is, it tries to gather the prophetic muttasil hadith of Abu Hanifah. So what Imam Hanifah raised from Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam with a muttasil chain. But the author doesn't rely on the Masanid at all. So the Jami Masanid doesn't rely upon it at all. And he only relies upon the Kitab al-Athars and then other hadith that he may find in Imam Hanifah in other books. And so hence you get the number 70 odd around, right? And then he concludes by looking at the question of, is Imam Hanifah corroborated on these or not? And he finds that in the bulk of them that he is corroborated. So he agrees that he is by minimum saduq, if not thiqah. That's like the conclusion of the author. But he doesn't use the Masanid. So that shows that if you take the Masanid out and you also take out the Mursal reports, you take out the Mawquf reports, you have quite a small number.
Yeah.
Now, the question arises is that who's more accurate?
Yeah.
Is this dissertation showing us this number of hadith, or is it the Mawsu'ah?
Yeah.
Right? Who's giving more of it, or the Jami Masanid? Who's giving a more accurate picture regarding Imam Abu Hanifah's narration? That's the question. That's the burning question. So we'll touch upon that, inshallah. But there's a few kind of points about the book that should be mentioned in terms of praise.
Yeah.
So every book that we look at, we try to mention the pros of the book, praise the author where the author's made efforts, especially if a book like this, which is 18 volumes. You don't want to just dismiss a scholarship outright because you disagree with some certain points. So there has to be points of praise that the author's done. And then we'd also mention some mulahadat, some things which I think are a bit of an issues with the book.
Even better ifs.
Yeah, but not necessarily. Some are quite, some critiques can be methodological.
Yeah.
And if it's a methodological critique, that would affect a lot of the book.
Yes.
Right? And there's something which are like factual errors. Like we've done some books we look at and you say, well, this is just a mistake, or if you looked at this, it would be better. But it doesn't affect the overall methodology of the book. So you'll find some of those issues here as well. So let's first start off with some of the key points. So I mentioned 4 major points of praise regarding this book, and you can add on that whenever you want, or ask some questions if you need be. So the first thing is that this book is by far the most comprehensive collection of the ahadith of Imam Abu Hanifah. It includes the whole of Jami Masanid al-Khawarizmi and much more. Right, so it's much larger. So that itself is a significant task. And also you see the author, because he's published a lot of these books himself, he has a connection with the manuscripts of the books as well.
Yeah.
Right, so there's a difference here. One is like, let's say if I'm doing a collection, I'm working off what's published already. Because he's published a lot of these Masanid, like the Harithi's one, Ibn Khusraw's one, Jami Masanid, and Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani's. He has a connection with the Makhtutat, which is a big thumbs up for having him do the collection.
Which helps with the accuracy of the text.
So it makes the collection much more accurate. Number 2 is that the Shaykh, he attributes every hadith to his original source. And he doesn't drop the sanad. So if you go to the Mawsu'ah, so this is a random volume I picked up, right? So what he would do, so he has this is again random page, right? So he has a chapter here which is called Babu ma ja'a fi tahrim mut'at an-nisa. So the chapter regarding the prohibition of doing mut'ah with women. So the first hadith he cites, it's from the Kitab al-Athar Imam Abu Yusuf. So he starts, right? So he mentions the Sanad of Abu Yusuf to Abu Hanifah and Nafi ibn Umar the hadith mentioned. And the second hadith is from Kitab al-Athar Imam Muhammad. So he starts, Muhammad, Akhbar, and so on and so forth. And then the next hadith he cites is from the Musnad of al-Harithi. And then the full Sanad as found in the Musnad al-Harithi is mentioned. So he mentions from his Shaykh, Akhbarana Ahmad Muhammad wa Sa'id al-Hamdani, Qala Hadith Ja'far, and then the Sanad goes on. So each of those hadith now are cited with full Sanad going back to Imam Abu Hanifah. This is useful again for a number of reasons. One main reason being is that a lot of the students or people looking at these books may not have those sources accessible to them. So by having the full sanad here, it kind of allows me not having to, I can basically use this hadith without having to locate in the original sources because he's presented it as such completely.
And it's in order. So it's
in order, yeah. So nothing's been like, what he's done, I was mentioning, because it was mentioned as a point of critique of this book, which I don't necessarily agree with, is that he's mentioned them all separately. So even though there's the same narration. So for example, the narration that Abu Yusuf cites is from Nafi ibn Umar from Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and the one from Imam Muhammad is the same.
Yeah.
It's Nafi' but he's mentioned both complete. Now, of course, that increases the size of the book significantly because of that, and the number of hadith, because the same hadith cited different ways. But as an encyclopedia, which is meant to be, size is not an issue then.
Yeah.
Because you're okay with. So, for example, if someone's providing a tahqiq of these ahadith, then the focus is the tahqiq now, right? So, if I'm doing like a tahqiq of this book, for example, there's no need for me to republish the 18 volumes and then add my notes and add another 5-6 volumes, make probably 22 volumes, right?
Yeah.
Rather, what I will do is say, summarize the content and do it. But because it's encyclopedia, this is justified then.
Yeah.
So sometimes copy and paste is justified. And this is an example, right? So you actually appreciate that. So that's point number 2. So they go back to the original sources. You can go refer back to them. Some of the references he actually cites back to his own, so most of the books to his own publications. And a couple of instances, the book is actually not published of his yet. Because I remember when I first got this, he was citing back to Musnad Abu Hanifah by Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani. And I was going back to the one I had, and it didn't have it in the place that he said. Then I found out that he's actually published it. So they had to buy his one that you can easily locate. So that's the thing to kind of look out for. Okay, that's point number 2 in terms of praise. Number 3 is that he is organized into a Sunan. There's abab fiqhiyya, right? So it's quite easy to locate. It's got a very detailed content page as well. So it's quite easy to locate the hadith you want to find. Again, this is significant, right? It's not easy tasks, right? It's a significant, the size of it. So it makes it's very helpful for students to find the relevant hadith of Abu Hanifah. And lastly, what we shouldn't, I didn't mention this before, is that when Imam Al-Khawarizmi wrote his Jami al-Masanid, he dedicated at the end a section to the entries of the people that have come in the Asanid. So the figures that I mentioned, the Asanid from the author of the Musnad back to Abu Hanifah, and then the sanad above, the figures that I mentioned, he brought biographical information regarding them. The problem is that it's not. There's a lot of people that he missed. Right, or he didn't provide a complete biography for. Sheikh Lateef al-Bahraiji, he has 3 dedicated volumes at the end to providing entries for the people that are mentioned in the Masanid. That's a major, it's a pro. Right, it's a pro because it's 3 volumes and there's a lot of corrections. So people that are missed out rather from the Jami Masanid, which he's added in here.
Especially with the Rijaal of these kind of Masanid, might be hard
sometimes
to
difficult to locate. And he also mentions as well, he tries to, I haven't gone through him to see how meticulous he is, but he does mention which Musnad narrates from this person. So if it's from like Musnad Imam Azam of al-Harithi, he will mention it. Or Ibn Khusra, he will mention it. So that's a plus point. These are 4, great points of benefit of the Mawsu'ah.
Now, a question that can come up now, like with such an extensive work as this, where he's listed every single narration from every single Musnad, even if it's a repeat, etc. Now, does he engage in, although he's mentioned all of the Rijaal of the Asanid in there, or he's tried to compile them, where Al-Khawarizmi missed them out, etc., does he then engage in doing Tasheeh and Tad'eef of Ahadith in there?
Right, so no. So in terms of there's 2 aspects of Tasheeh and Tad'eef here. This is now we're going to go into the Mulahadat, right? So the first thing about the sheer size of it. So now some of the points of concern that we can have is that the Ahadith in the Mawsu'ah comes to 10,587.
Which is a considerable amount.
It's a considerable amount. So 10,587 based upon the counting that he's given her. The figure is 10,587. And the reason for such a large size of this is because of the repetition. Right? The repetition comes. And so it would be useful for us to have maybe a dual counting system to say, well, this is the same hadith being repeated. And then so you have your 10,587, which is the overall that we come back to him. And then you have those, which is the actual hadith number that he actually narrated. So you have like the one hadith, like Mut'ah, there's probably about 7 versions of them. So you have like, that's one hadith, 7 turuq. Right? So maybe some sort of, that would be nice so we can actually see how many distinct narrations there are. But another problem that you have with this is that the repetition is not a problem. So some people mention this. There's repetition and he's numbered again. No problem, right? You want to make that as a complaint. I don't really have any major issue with that. But there's some places in the Mawsu'ah where there's no need for that narration to be there. Right? Because the idea which he himself says in the beginning of the Mawsu'ah in volume 1, page 19, he says that the purpose of this is تجميع أحاديث رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم برواية الإمام حنيفة من دواوين السنة معروفة. So the ideal goal is to provide the prophetic narrations. But no problem, right? You want to put in the aqwal al-sahaba, okay. Even aqwal al-tabi'een, you want to put that in the, right. You want to put in the Mawsu'ah hadithiyah, you can justify that. But there's some narrations in there which don't make sense to have it at all. So for example, if you look at hadith number 10,570 near the end, 10,570, there's a chapter he has, which is about ما أقر الإمام حنيفة بما أفتى به داود الطائي صاحب الإمام أبي حنيفة بمسائل الفرائض. So it's a chapter of a fatwa of Imam Hanifa's student Dawud al-Ta'i, the famous Zahid.
Yeah.
So he gave a fatwa regarding inheritance mas'ala, and Imam Hanifa affirming it. And the narration, we're going to read it, right? But just go back to it, because it's available online, this is a PDF, right? 10,570, hadith number. It's just that. He gives a fatwa, Dawud al-Ta'i, and Imam Hanifa does iqrar of it.
Is that counted amongst
That's
the numbers?
a separate number, yeah. That's number 10,570.
Okay.
Right? So that has no connect. There's no. I don't see the reason for that to be there. Otherwise, you can then put a lot of things in there. There's fiqhi masail attributed. Kitab al-Asl, Imam Hanifah said this. Why don't you put that in there? Or there's all sorts of things you can add in there, right? So that these kind of narrations, I don't see the connection between it. If this was cited as saying collecting all aqwal of Imam Hanifah, then fine.
Yeah.
But then you have a much larger book then, right? But if it's going to be what we're assuming, prophetic narrations, and then we say, okay, let's make that more broad and say include aqwal al-sahaba, aqwal al-tabi'een, then fair enough, right? But to put these kind of statements in there, I think there's no reason for that to be there.
Okay.
So that's in terms of, we'll go about the Tasheeh question in a second, right? But that's in terms of some of the, of the first mulahadha, is that there's some narrations in there that don't really need to be there.
Yeah.
You can even object to like him putting in the narration of Ibrahim Nakha'i. So Abu Hanifah narrates Hammam Sulaiman, Ibrahim Nakha'i, a mas'ala. Fine. But I'm saying some could make it as an objection.
A question on this. So there was in one of the previous books that we discussed, he mentioned, the author mentioned Ahmed Sinobar. He mentioned in his book that figures like Ibrahim al-Nakha'i and even some of his aqran, some of the people that were same tabaqa, they were sometimes wary of narrating directly to the Prophet ﷺ, but then they would specifically say, but I don't mind, instead I ascribe it to my teacher or Abdullah ibn Mas'ud rather than narrating from the Prophet ﷺ as a measure of caution.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with those kind of statements?
Fine. That's fine. Like I said, there's a potential objection you can mention because the idea is supposed to be prophetic narrations.
Yeah.
And then we go one generation down, Sahaba, and then you want to go to Tabi'een as well. Okay. Right. And remember, Imam Nakha'i is not from the Tabi'un that narrate excessively from Sahaba.
Yeah.
In most of the narrations, if not all of them, were from Kibar Tabi'een, right? So, but okay, like I said, that's not a major objection to the book. Like because the Kitab al-Athar, the bulk of that is narration of Imam Nakha'i anyway.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. It's these other narrations which are objectionable.
Yeah.
That will be found. So I gave you one example of that. So I don't think there's any connection with that. The second point is, and this is coming back to the issue of Tasheeh, is that when we're looking at the Masanid of Imam Abu Hanifah, there's two things we have to look at. Number one is the connection, is the sanad from Imam Abu Hanifah back to Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam or the Sahabi, whoever we're talking about. So that's the aspect to study. But then for me to make that study, I need to first prove that this was actually uttered or written by Imam Abu Hanifah himself.
Yes.
If I can't prove that, then I can come out and say elaborate tahqiq.
Yeah.
I can bring, this hadith also comes in Bukhari, Muslim, I can mention all of that. But that's not going to help in proving our point because of the fact that...
Did Bukhari even say it? Sorry, did Abu Hanifah even say it?
Exactly. Did Imam Abu Hanifah actually even say this?
Yeah.
So that's a major shortcoming in a lot of Shaykh Lateef al-Bahraji's works, and not just him, a lot of people who have dealt with the Masanid.
Yeah.
Right, and we'll even the book Al-Inayah will talk about this as well, right?
Yeah.
Is that there's a lot of times that people have attributed stuff back to Imam Hanifa using some of these books which are dubious.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no study of the Sanad from Imam Hanifa, from the author of the Musnad back to Imam Hanifa.
Is that based on an assumption that it's fairly accurate?
Yeah, it's based on assumption. And there have been some scholars have explicitly said this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably good to mention here that right now I've written a work on this.
Mm-hmm.
This topic, this is what we're talking about, which is a study of the largest, you can say, source for Al-Bahraji, which is the two books of Imam Abu Abdullah al-Harithi.
Mm-hmm.
One is called the Musnad Imam al-A'zam, which is a 2-volume book. It's a 2 hefty volumes of Imam Hanifa's narrations. And then there's a second work, which is the Manaqib, which is Kashf al-Athar al-Sharifa, fi Manaqib Abu Hanifa. There's 2 bulky volumes as well, both published by Shaykh Lateef al-Bahraji. And this kind of makes up the bulk, if not at least half of the size of the book, if not more than that, right? Of this Mawsu'ah is made up of al-Harithi.
4,000, 5,000 narrations, right?
Probably more, but yeah, approximately. Let's say around that. Well, half, let's say, right, if not more, are made up of al-Harithi. The problem that you have, again, is twofold. One is the question mark of al-Harithi himself. So this book I've written, which discusses Imam al-Harithi, Abu Abdullah al-Harithi, and his Musnad in detail. And then at the end, I do mention these points that we mentioned now about, I'll note this is currently being edited. To be sent off for editing. And so hopefully we'll discuss this in more detail when that is eventually inshallah published or is going to be a publication. We will talk about the book in more detail. So just to kind of cite a conclusion from there, and then we can talk maybe in subsequent episodes about this in more detail, is that the Musnad of al-Harithi or his books are not reliable, right? Because one is that the author himself has been criticized heavily, right? Heavily criticized. And then assuming he is trustworthy, as some scholars like Shaykh Bahraji has tried to argue himself, then okay, let's say it's thiqah, no problem. But then the sanad from al-Harithi back to Imam Hanifah is not studied. And that's a major problem. So what Shaykh Lateef al-Rahman Bahraji does in many instances is that he will cite a hadith, right? So this is an example. You'll find he does this in his Musnad Imam al-A'zam of al-Harithi, and then in the Mawsu'ah he will do it sometimes, or when he refers back to the Musnad, you go back there, you'll find this. What he would do, he would do the following. This is from the Musnad Imam al-A'zam al-Harithi by al-Harithi, edited by Bahraji. So you have the hadith that al-Harithi with the sanad, he says, أخبرنا الصالح ibn Ahmad قال حدثنا شعيب بن أيوب قال حدثنا أبو يحيى الهماني قال حدثنا أبو حنيفة and Al-Qam al-Marth, and then the hadith goes on, right? Then in the footnote, what does Shaykh Bahraji say? He says, this hadith أخرجه عبد الرزاق, right? Ahmed, is Muslim Ahmed, Darimi, in Sahih Muslim, in Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Nasai, Abu Ubayd fi Tuhur, Ibn Jarud, Ibn Khuzaymah, right? And he mentions Tahawi, all these sources, they all mention this hadith via multiple routes going back to Sufyan al-Thawri from Al-Qama with the same sanad. And then he doesn't comment anything about it, right? Now what's the problem here? Is that all of these sources have the hadith being cited by Sufyan al-Thawri to Al-Qama. Imam Hanifah is not there. Right? It's Sufyan al-Thawri to Al-Qama. And so no one else other than Harithi has this sanad going back to Abu Hanifah narrating this hadith. So you can't find anyone else, just anyone that narrates this hadith with this sanad, it goes back to Sufyan al-Thawri. But then what he misses here, which is a major problem, okay, fine, why don't Abu Hanifah narrate it and Sufyan al-Thawri? Right? But the problem you have is that the sanad from al-Harith, the Shaykh of al-Harith, let's assume the Harith thiqa, we're giving you that, right? The Shaykh who's Salih ibn Ahmad, he's matruk. He's a discarded narrator. So this hadith is not thabit from Imam Abu Hanifah. That's got nothing to do disparaging Imam's status. It doesn't do anything to his status at all. It makes no difference adding this hadith onto it, right? But it's not thabit from him. In the footnote, you have this lengthy takhrij being done, but the takhrij is not helping us.
It's for the hadith itself.
It's for the hadith itself, exactly. So if you're going to make a collection on the Masanid of Abu Hanifah or the Mawsu'ah, etc., the purpose of these collections for most people are reading it is saying, what did Imam Abu Hanifah narrate? So the maqsad of the editor, the maqsad of the book itself is to do ithbat of that to Imam Abu Hanifah. So even if they did the ithbat of that and then not discuss the sanad later on, no problem. Because the maqsad is fulfilled. You can actually say, my job wasn't to go and find out if the hadith is sahih or not, it's just to show Abu Hanifah's hadith. You can do that, no problem. But if you're going to study the sanad from Abu Hanifah onwards and mention the turuq for it, where you haven't even done ithbat in Abu Hanifah at the beginning, that's a major problem. And that's an underlining issue throughout the Mawsu'ah. Right? It's something that I go into great detail when discussing the mulahadat of it. And the third, there's four major mulahadats I mentioned, right? The third issue that I have, well, let's stick to the third one. The fourth one could be repetitive because it's a bit similar to the third one. The second one, sorry. The third mulahada is that we did praise the fact that the narrators of the Mawsu'ah, they had these 3 volumes where he writes the biographies of him. We did mention that Khawarizmi missed some and Bahraji added them in. But the issue also have is that there's many narrators that even Bahraji couldn't find. And instead of telling us that they're majhul, he's just not mentioned them there.
You just left them out.
Just left them out. And that becomes difficult. Because sometimes I'm looking for a narrator and I go look in them and it's not there. So I'm thinking, well, what's missed out? So what would be useful for us, of course we praise the effort, is that if he said after the narrator name, put all the narrator's name, and he said, I didn't find him.
Yeah.
Aqif alayhi, whatever, no problem.
Just to give an idea of how difficult it is to find, I remember you were mentioning one specific narrator that you had to go and search into Shi'i books to find him.
Find tafsil about him, because it's difficult. Because what happens is sometimes when you go into, although I sent this off to Sheikh Abdullah Judai'i, that bahath, and he said, don't use Shia books. I won't. Told me off. But especially narrators that come later on.
Yeah.
When you look at the Kutub al-Sitta, these kind of, they're very popular, easy to find.
Yeah.
In these kind of more obscure books, or especially books that come later, so even al-Harithi
to do with regions in the east.
Exactly. It becomes far more difficult to locate narrators. You're a bit stuck with who the name is, and there's a lot of kind of vague names, Balkhis, etc., but you can't find them. Or sometimes a lot of the instances of narrators that I look into when they come to al-Harithi is Musnad, which, like I said, we'll discuss that in much more detail, inshallah, in subsequent episodes. But you might find an entry, if you're lucky, but then you'll find no praise or dispraise as a narrator, so you don't really have anything to go off. Are they thiqa, not thiqa, etc. So it's quite difficult. And there's a reason to this as well, because I spoke to a couple of mashayikh about this, and there's a reason why some authors like this do this. These obscure narrators, we'll discuss this inshallah in subsequent episodes. But anyway, back to the Mawsu'ah, because we want to move off too much from that, right? So a large part of the Mawsu'ah so this doesn't now demonstrate to us what Imam Hanifah's actual hadith are. What this is good for is to show us what has been attributed to Imam Hanifah.
Yes.
So when people look at it and say, this shows Imam Hanifah had 10,000, we know that's not true.
No.
Right? And nor does this in any way question the status of Imam Hanifah as a narrator of hadith. Doesn't affect it at all.
Yes.
Because all it shows that he didn't narrate what you claimed he narrated.
Yes.
And there's many narrations like that from other people as well. There's many narrations that attribute to Malik. And someone comes along and says, that's not Malik's narration.
Imam Daraqutni has a work on this, right?
Exactly. There's many works that people have attributed to certain authors, and someone comes along and says, that's not their hadith.
Yeah.
Whole collections, especially Imam Hanifah as well. There's actually people that have added a whole collection of hadith. They just fabricated Imam Hanifah. So anyway.
So in terms of like this, now we've come with this issue that it's very difficult to sift out what is attributed to Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah and what he actually narrated.
Yeah.
Now, what are some of the methods that we could use as coming into this, looking at these ahadith and maybe wanting to use some of them? What are some of the methods that we can use to sift out what is falsely ascribed, possibly, and what is muthbit or thabit from Imam Abu Hanifah?
So
rahimahullah?
we've started this project already.
Yeah.
Right? We started a project with another person as well, so where we first start off with what we know, which is his Kitab al-Athar.
Yeah.
That's the go-to book. If you know Imam Hanifah's hadith, it's a go-to book. And then you find other ahadith from Imam Hanifah in other books of Imam Muhammad. So you can look at the Kitab, the Hujjah al-Madinah, the Zawaid al-Muwatta. You can look at Kitab al-Asl. We'll talk about the significance of this book as well, Kitab al-Asl. These books actually have a lot of Imam Hanifah's hadith, and then you have the general hadith books in general.
Yeah.
And yes, you have Masanid. So one of the more reliable Musnads, Imam Hanifah's Musnad Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani.
Yes.
So you could use the Musnad Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani. And then there's other Masanid that there hasn't been any thorough tahqiq done on as of yet. So this, what I've written about is specifically on the Musnad of al-Harithi. And I've said why that obviously is reliable. There's other Masanid. The Musnad al-Talha, these kind of Masanid that are there, Jami Asanid, which what needs to be done is
the same kind of study.
Yeah, same kind of study, but because they're not published separately, you need to kind of take out those hadith of Jami Asanid, put them together, see what's in there, see if it's corroborated or not, and then be able to attribute that or not back to Imam Hanifah.
So,
but we do have a collection of narrations that we know Imam Hanifah narrated via Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Hanifah. So to say that's all there is. I was saying we have that as solid, and then we have others which are fairly, because we've got Asanid going back, and there's these kind of collections where there's more tahrir, more tahqiq that's required. And that's something, inshallah, that we're planning to do as we, go through. But that's the plan, inshallah.
The more we do it, the more mammoth of a task it seems.
Yeah, it's quite a hefty task. It's not easy. So back to the Mawsu'ah, as in, just to kind of give an overview of it then.
Yeah.
Useful work, right? Useful work, but there is a lot that needs to be, I think, considered before you utilize such works.
Yes. A lot of things to be wary of.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. I mean, this discussion of the Masanid, the Mawsu'ah of Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah, this leads into another work which has been much more recently published regarding the Kitab al-Hidayah, the famous Hanafi text on fiqh that almost every Hanafi institute or institute teaches in some sort of way or bases its teaching curriculum off of. So the next work we're going to look at is a work called al-Inayah في تحقيق الأحاديث الغريبة في الهداية في الهداية. It's by Molana Yusuf Shabir, published in, I think, last month or 2 months ago. This work is a work that deals with the ahadith that Imam Zayla'i calls gharib in his book, which is known as al-Rayah. So this work, what does Molana Yusuf Shabir try to do using these reports that Imam Zayla'i calls gharib?
So just to clarify, the Mawsu'ah is published in 2021.
Oh, 2021.
Mawsu'ah, right? I didn't mention. So that's so it's still very recent.
Yeah.
This book, as you mentioned, just a month ago, if that.
Yeah.
I've got a hold of the book. It's like the 3rd week now, 3 weeks ago, and so just to highlight what I've done with the book, right? So there's 2 bulky volumes.
Yeah.
Right? 2 bulky volumes.
Heavy.
And there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in this book. So you have one which is the main maqsad of the kitab, which is the title. And then you have a lot of other things that are happening in the book, which is a bit difficult to touch on everything, but I've tried to organize some thoughts. I've read the first volume quite, thoroughly, right? There's various things I've had to know and look into, inshallah. And then the second volume, I've gone through, read through parts of it, other parts read more closely. So that's where we're at right now. And I'm trying to, organize those thoughts, because as I mentioned, there's quite a lot of things going in this book. So I'll try to explain what that means. You already explained what the basic notion of the book is. The idea is that you have Imam Marginani's book al-Hidayah, which is not unique to Hidayah, but a lot of books of fiqh, they have this issue where when it comes to them citing hadith, they're not particularly accurate. And this is again not unique to Sahib al-Hidayah. You have examples like the Fathul Aziz of Rafi'i, right, where a lot of Shafi'i scholars come after and they may try to source these hadith, and they may not be found the way that Rafi'i has narrated them. Not to say that is the same, all right, because Rafi'i was a competent hadith scholar. Marginani's standing as a hadith scholar is something that's discussed here as well, where the author concludes that although he was not a muhaddith hafid, he had awareness of the field.
Yeah.
Right, and we'll try to mention what that means, inshallah. Right, so the basic notion of this book is that once Imam Marginani wrote his Hidayah, people started to praise the work and they started to write commentaries to it. But one thing you start noticing is that Imam Marginani brings hadith to justify his position. So it's not a mukhtasar in the sense like Quduri, where there's no hadith we mentioned.
Yeah.
There's adilla we mentioned. So there's akli and naqli evidences, rational proofs and textual evidences. So the effort of a lot of the Hanafi scholars, and you see even some non-Hanafis, was to try to provide sourcing of these hadith.
Yes.
Some of these were as part of the commentary, right? Like with Badruddin Aini, and other and Ibn Humam, and others were dedicated works. And the most famous of this was Zayla'i's book, which is entitled Nasb al-Rayah. He also mentions here that the name of this book, Nasb al-Rayah, this is something that I've noted in the book that I've sent off for publication as well, and I first came across this point from a student of Mufti Hussain Kadodia. He mentioned this point that the name of the book, Nasb al-Rayah, is actually not the name of Imam Zayla'i, and he goes into some detail here explaining that. That's actually the name was given to Ibn Hajar's own book, al-Dirayah.
Yeah.
And people thought mistakenly thought it was actually the name of Zayla'i's book, but we're going to call it Nasb al-Rayah here for ease purposes, just get confusing, right?
Just for those who don't know as well, why did these scholars need to do takhrij of the ahadith of Hidayah? Because the ahadith are mentioned, right? So why do we need to source them in that sense?
So these are, in these fiqh books, these are secondary sources.
Yeah.
So when they're citing a hadith, they don't reference them. So if those who study Hidayah, most of these books of hadith, most books of fiqh, sorry, they will just say, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said.
Yeah.
Right? Or it's been narrated by so-and-so. Abdul Mas'ud's position. It comes in the athar. They'll say these kind of general statements. And because you're teaching these books of fiqh, you're just carrying on parroting what's being said. And we actually see this example. There's a paper written by Ustad Suhail Hanif, which discusses like the method the Hanafis had when engaging with hadith. So he calls something called the Salaf-based approach. Although I disagree with this completely, right? But the idea he tries to show is, which he does quite nicely in this paper of his, where he mentions how some, like the Ottomans, even post these takhrij works, many of them couldn't care less. So they'll still cite the same Hadith of Hidayah, even though they've been classified as being discarded.
Mm-hmm.
So there are just some fiqh authors who are just not interested in that.
Yeah.
But many Hanafi fiqh scholars or people teaching these works, it was quite neat to say, where are this hadith from?
Yeah.
What's the accurate version of this hadith? And that's where these books of takhrij come into play.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Zayla'i Nasb al-Rayah, then you have a Mukhtasar of it by Ibn Hajar, it's called al-Dirayah, also known as Nasb al-Rayah, right? Or not known as, but it should be called. And then you have, after him, you have three major authors, Ibn Humam,
Mm-hmm.
Badr Du'aini, and Imam Qasim al-Qutnubugha.
Yep.
Right? Imam Qasim al-Qutnubugha being probably the most important out of these.
We've also got authors that he discusses prior.
Prior as well, yeah. We'll come to that, yeah. So he's got these three, so in essence, it's actually the main thrust of this book.
Yeah.
Right? It actually goes back to these five guys.
Yeah.
The contributions mentioned, because before Zayla'i wrote his takhrij, you have the author Abdul Qadir al-Qurashi and Ibn Turkmani.
Yes.
They both wrote takhrij on Hidayah as well. And but because Zayla'i more or less includes the content of their works and adds much more to it, you don't get much attention given to his book. So there are some, even though he cites from those works, and there's some places where he says that Zayla'i's criticism was unfounded, but generally speaking, there isn't much value to those books once you've got Zayla'i and these books that come after it, because it's I'm talking about independent value.
Yeah.
So the main are these five authors. What is also added in here is Ibn Abil Izz al-Hanafi.
Yeah.
And Ibn Abil Izz, he is also a person that he adds in there, which we'll discuss, which has, might be question mark as in what is he doing in there, right? But there's a reason why he puts them in there. We'll talk about it, inshallah. So the book itself, so this is the main five authors that he's looking at. And Qasim al-Qutnubugha is probably one of the most important because he's actually the one who dedicated a book to istidrakat, these kind of corrections. And so this is not just corrections found in, so he's got one book dedicated to correcting what's come in the takhrij of Hidayah before him. And then he's got other books of takhrij, which are published now, a lot of them, right? And so what the author does is he finds that in a lot of those books, he's actually mentioned corrections, because remember, in a fiqh book, you have the same hadith that are cited.
Yeah.
Right? So one of the usefulness of the book is that when Imam Marginani mentions a hadith, he will tell us the Hanafi scholars before Marginani mentioned the hadith as well.
Yeah.
So if it's Ghasani, Sarakhsi, Halwani, whatever, the Dabusi, he will mention that, they cited it as well. And then what you can do is when you know that they've cited it, and Qasim Qutnubugha's got like a takhrij on al-Ikhtiyar. Many of the hadith and Ikhtiyar are going to be found in Hidayah as well. So you go to Takhrij Ikhtiyar or Usul al-Bazdawi, and you can basically see him sometimes discuss or mention parts of the hadith which is not mentioned in his Muryat al-Mu'i, which is his istidrak on the previous takhrij. So he does that. So these are the main five, if you like, authors that make the bulk of the book. Right? That's how it's kind of structured. So you got your initial, what the Hanafi scholars have said, who cited it before him, and then you have these authors after that have discussed the book itself.
Imam Qasim al-Qutnubugha, his corrections make up the bulk of these.
From historically, So he's got a summary. So there's a lot of these kind of diagrams where he's kind of summarized the content of the book within it. So he talks about a lot of things like, what does Zayla'i mean by gharib? That's istilah of his. But in terms of corrections, as follows. So he finds that Ibn Hajar, he only corrects Zayla'i once. In these places. So this is another point, right? That this is not a complete takhrij of Hidayah. I know you mentioned it, but just to clarify this point, right? So if you're going to go through Hidayah and you come across a hadith, it's not necessarily going to be in here.
It's going to be in Nasb al-Rayah probably.
It will be in Nasb al-Rayah, definitely. Right? Or most likely you find it there. And then you're not going to necessarily find, you're only going to find it if you went to look in Nasb al-Rayah and he says gharib, then you went to look at the discussion in this book. So it's not comprehensive. So when he says Ibn Hajar corrected Zayla'i, it means corrected on the place of gharib. Other places he may have corrected him as well. But because Ibn Hajar is doing an ikhtisar, there's not really much of istidrak maybe taking place. But at least in this place, he found one place. In the 370 odd narrations that he looks at. Badr al-Aini, 18, istidrak. Ibn Humam, 15. Qasim al-Qutnubugha, 61. Ibn Abil Izz, 1. And the author himself, 80.
Okay.
Right? 80 points of istidrak.
Okay. Now, we've already discussed Ibn Hajar only having one correction and the reason why, or the possible reason why. Now, Ibn Abil Izz, Imam Ibn Abil Izz al-Hanafi, we'll come to that as well. He only has one correction as well.
Yeah.
So now, is his placement in his book needed, do you think?
So it's an interesting question. I'm sure the author can justify this, but so there's because the first 200-300 pages is an introduction. So there's a lot of stuff going on there as well, like different points. Like I said, it's we can't summarize all. It'd be too much to go through the
Two
stuff,
full
right?
words and then a huge introduction. Like,
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff going on there, right? But he has one section which he dedicates to Ibn Abil Izz, and the section is about Ibn Abil Izz being a Hanafi. And in it, he cites, like, he goes, some Indian scholars and some South African scholars have questioned whether Ibn Abil Izz is actually a Hanafi or not. And he responds by saying, but no, many scholars refer to him as a Hanafi.
yes.
And he gives like a lot of these kind of documentary that this person called him Hanafi. And by the way, this is well established.
Yeah.
So I don't know who he's referring to, all right? Those who say he's not Hanafi. But I can assume I know what they mean by that. But let me come back to that a second, right? So there's many books, there's a book that came out not too long ago dedicated to the Ibn Abil Izz al-Hanafi. This is by the Salafi scholar, Mashur Hassan al-Salman, which is called Mihnatu Ibn Abil Izz al-Hanafi. This is the second edition of it. It's larger than the previous one. And again, if you go to the biography section, it was well-known Hanafi scholar. So when he says that some scholars are denied him being a Hanafi, well, we have to first put a question out there is, when people say that, what do they mean by it? Because sometimes, like, are these people don't know that he's been referred to as Hanafi? If that's the case, then fair enough. You've shown that people called him a Hanafi. Great. But the question we have is that, look, you've got this person who all the Hanafis before and after him around this time period, those who come after, were Maturidis. He's not.
Yeah.
Right? Heavily influenced by Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim, his Sharh on Aqidah Tahawiyah. There's actually been studies done by Salafi scholars showing that large parts of it is copy and pasted from Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim. So we've got a large influence of Ibn Taymiyyah on him, and this book clearly demonstrates if there's any doubt left in that, right?
Yeah.
But again, that's Aqidah.
Yeah.
So someone says, well, so what about Aqidah, right? Like, there's people before, and he mentions this, like Zamakhshari was a Mu'tazili, and Jassas has Mailan to I'tizal, Qarhi was a Mu'tazili, and so on and so forth, right? So what's the problem? The second issue we have is that when it comes to fiqh works, he doesn't have a Hanafi fiqh work in this true sense. What he does have is he has some of the Rasail, where he tends to take actually a position against the majority of the madhab in those cases. And he has a book called Tanbih ala Mushkilat al-Hidayah. This is what he's using.
Yeah.
Where he's approaching the book Hidayah. If you read it, he doesn't approach it as a Hanafi. He approaches it as a critic, as a mujtahid.
Yeah.
Right? As a mujtahid. And again, if this isn't a point of being fanatical Hanafis, etc. It's just to talk about reality.
Yeah.
Is that if I approach the madhab, and let's say, like, I don't have the tools of ijtihad, nor do I claim it, right? But let's say I do claim it. I say mujtahid now. Even though I'm Hanafi brought up, etc., and I approach a book and I start doing complete, so I say, Imam Shafi is right here. He got this wrong. Imam Ahmed is right here. And this is what I do. Am I still a Hanafi? It's a question. It depends what you're looking at, right? So if someone says he's not a Hanafi, well, I would assume what they mean by that is that he's not an authority in the Hanafi madhab because he doesn't speak as a Hanafi. Right? If you want to do a bahth in tahqiq, etc., then fine, no problem. But he's not someone that you can cite because he's not representing the madhab.
Yes.
There's a fine distinction here.
Yes.
That's where Ibn Humam was called out, was because of his. Because let me try to explain this way, right? Again, we're Hanafis. If I go and I say on any given issue, and he shows that, Masha Tanwi, these scholars had these positions, by the way, right? And I say, on this mas'ala in the Hanafi madhab, I think Imam Shafi'i is correct.
Yeah.
A later Hanafi who's looking at the Hanafi position can't cite me as a Hanafi position now because I wasn't doing tahrir the Hanafi madhab.
Yeah.
Whereas there's other places, let's say someone like who does it a lot is Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri, rahimahullah. You see many a times that he takes a position, but what he's trying to do is trying to say, this is actually what Imam Abu Hanifah meant. Right? Or the way the Hanafis did tahrir of this mas'ala is wrong. Tahrir should be done this way. So it may be a different conclusion, but because he's doing it as a Hanafi, that may be now called a Hanafi position.
Yeah.
Right? So when people, so what I'm saying is that the bahth fine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually do tahrir of what the major concern is.
Yeah.
So people are saying it's not Hanafi, first he doesn't explain who they are, what the people are. Is it someone that he's spoken to or people that he's heard?
And what do they mean?
What do they mean by it? Because it's an important distinction to make. Otherwise, to show us that Ibn Abil Izz is called Hanafi,
It's very easy.
not. It's quite. Like I said, these kind of books have been published. A while back, and you can look into it. They've got all the data there.
Yeah.
Showing that. So that's the point of Ibn Izz. And then secondly, his contribution to the book. Now, from what I've seen, unless I've missed it, I found he says one place. I looked into. He's got a diagram where he mentioned istidrak. So I went to the place that he's done istidrak. Even that correction that Ibn Izz gives is not unique to him. It's something which I think Ibn Humam and a couple of other scholars gave.
Mm-hmm.
And the correction that he gives, he cites from where?
From
Musnad of al-Harithi. We spoke about that already.
Yeah.
So the only istidrak that I found that he used, the one, which I assume, unless I'm missing it, right, is not of any worth, right? Because we're saying that the author is accused of fabrication. The book is not trustworthy. So I don't see the need of Ibn Izz being in this work.
You could come back and say that in the interest of being comprehensive, which is what the author was trying to do, right?
Yeah, but then Ibn Izz is cited throughout the book,
Yeah,
reiterating what others have said.
exactly, yeah. So
Fine, no problem.
yeah,
But then you can add, but that's great. But then I'm saying there's authors like, there's a Ghayatul Bayan.
Mhm.
You can throw that in there.
Mhm.
Maybe, there's lots of other authors that have commented and stuff, right? You can
Yeah.
put them in there. If you want to do it, no problem. But I don't, it seems like Ibn Izz has been put in there deliberately just to kind of say, well, I'm going to put him in there and then I'm going to prove he's Hanafi as well. Allah knows best. But I don't really see the need of that as a in terms of academically what he provides to the picture, to the scene.
To the scene. Fine. So in terms of the author himself now, in terms of his methodology, how he actually comes across in terms of how does he formulate his book? So you mentioned that he relies on these 5 authors that preceded him in doing the takhrij, and he mentions their comments. He will mention for every single entry, he will mention what does Imam Zayla'i say, Imam Hajar, Imam Qasim ibn Qutubagha, Imam Aini, Imam Ibn Humam, and Imam Ibn Abil Izz. Now, are there any kind of issues in terms of how he does his methodological approach to the work itself?
No, it's a overall sound method, right? So what he would do is he'll mention what they've got to say, and if he's got anything, he will reference what they've got to say, and if anything to add, he'll add. Now, his corrections, the 80-odd corrections that he's mentioned, they vary in degree, right? Some of those corrections are, doesn't add anything to the equation, right? So I've made a couple of points here. So, for example, because when you look at finding a hadith, so it becomes sometimes a very technical discussion, which is that the wording that Imam Marginani cites, the ma'na may be well established, could be Bukhari, Muslim.
Yeah.
But when they say gharib, it means this wording is not found.
Yeah.
So he may go and find something with their wording of such. All right.
I think it was quite intricate in how he did it. He split into 4 types.
Yeah.
And he mentions exactly what he is
what
doing.
he does. And those types, by the way, are not the most they're not the most easy to follow.
Yeah.
All right. So maybe a bit more Allah knows best, but it wasn't the easiest to follow what those types are. But so for example, in volume 1, page 402. Yeah, here we are. So this is like an example of an istidrak. It's a correction, but it doesn't necessarily add much to the masla at hand. So for example, you have the hadith where Marginani says, he goes, وَإِن تَرَكَهَا جَازَ, meaning if you're praying salah with the adhan iqama. If you don't do it, it's fine. Why? Because Ibn Mas'ud then says, أَذَانُ الْحَيِّ يَكْفِينَ. The adhan of the locality suffices us. Now, this hadith, the scholars mention numerous narrations. It's very Ibn Mas'ud that he said something to this effect.
Yeah.
But the wording adhan, it was said iqamatul hayy, but not adhan. So he locates a version where the word adhan is mentioned in Bayhaqi's Sunan, right? And he cites that. Fine, right? So that's one which we say is is well established mas'ala, doesn't affect the mas'ala much. But then there's some which is added on which are useful.
Yeah.
So for example, in the mas'ala of the mas'ala of the donkey, left of the donkey, right?
Yeah.
Imam Marginani cites, he goes, this khilaf goes back to the various hadith of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, I think, and to the Sahaba as well.
Sahaba, yeah.
And so some scholars, they said, we didn't find this to certain Sahaba, one of the positions. So he locates this actually being established to certain Sahaba.
Which will have a tangible effect on the mas'ala.
Because then now Marginani is right.
Yeah.
Right? The Marginani here, and not just is he, like this mas'ala, the mas'ala is right, but this will actually establish the mas'ala itself.
Yeah.
Right? So there's tangibility to those as well. So the corrections vary. And remember, when you look at istidrak, because it's quite a technical bahath, it's quite a technical bahath. What happens is that we're looking at specific wording if it can be found. there's not a condition that it must be sahih.
Yeah.
So your wording that you find can potentially even be da'if.
Yeah.
Right? It can even potentially be da'if. And then hence why, you find him sometimes, so sometimes the hadith is found is still weak.
Yeah. Which is not discussed.
It varies.
It varies.
So in some places, the weakness of a given hadith is mentioned. Yeah. And I've highlighted certain places, it will take time, but there's highlighted certain places where a hadith has been mentioned and he's not graded it, even though being weak.
Yeah.
Right? And that has happened. And another, like a major point of that is that when it comes to the Musnad of Imam Abu Hanifah by Riwayat al-Harithi that we discussed, or the other Jami Asanid, it's used quite, so it's in certain places where he actually makes a point of it saying, Sheikh Awam has authenticated the hadith, but in actual fact, underneath Abu Hanifah is some da'if rawis. Now that's great. But in many other instances, the Musnad is used without any comment. So that's a bit of a, bit of consistency here. And I think because he does make a point, like for example, when he talks about Al-Waqidi, he mentioned that the book of Al-Waqidi, or he has a source, is discarded.
Yeah.
So anything after in the book where Waqidi is mentioned, he'll mention that point. Something similar should be done with Harithi as well.
Yeah.
And that's not done. So a lot of times Harithi is mentioned throughout his Musnad and it's not being critiqued, except for odd places here and there.
I think his reliance on his tone as well, just so that we are sticking to his methodology. His reliance on Imam Hakim's Mustadrak and the Muwafaqat of Imam Dhahabi.
Well, this is a bit, so it's interesting because what he mentions in one of the footnotes, but he doesn't practically implement this.
Yeah.
So he mentions, for example, in the second volume, he has this discussion here where he talks about the Tasheeh Hakim and the Muwafaqah of Dhahabi. And he mentions that he cites the studies of Sheikh Khalid Diris and Sheikh Hatim al-Auni and another study. And then he says that according to my, so this way it says, yeah. So he mentions those two studies. There's a book written by Sheikh Khalid Diris which is called Al-Idah al-Jali fi Naqdi Maqud al-Sahih al-Hakim wa Muwafaqah al-Dhahabi. And in these both works of Sheikh Hatim and in Sheikh Khalid Diris, they show that there's no such thing as Muwafaqah al-Dhahabi. Right? And they give numerous arguments for it. So he mentions those works. But despite mentioning those works, he says straight after that, he goes, وَالَّذِي يَظْهَرْ, that which is apparent, أَنَّ الذَّهَبِ لَمَّا يَحْكِي أو يلخص التصحيح الحاكم ولا يتعقبه فهذا موافقة له. Is that whenever Dhahabi mentions the Tasheeh of Hakim, the Hakim says Sahih, and he doesn't say anything follow up, that must be an agreement. But the books that he's citing, they do mention, they make a far wider critique of this whole notion.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't touch upon that.
Yeah.
Meaning he doesn't critique the books that he's citing. So it would have been useful because of the fact that you're citing those books to actually engage in those books and the arguments, because they're very specific arguments they've mentioned. One of the major arguments being is that al-Dhahabi, in his talkhis, he never mentioned that there's any qa'idah at play.
Yeah.
Nowhere does he mention it. And another argument Shaykh Hadith makes a big point of is that in his Siyar and other books, he actually mentions the number of hadith which are weak or fabricated in the Musnad al-Hakim. And if you compare that to his where he corrects it, it's only about 9-10% in comparison to what he claims, like 40-50%.
Yeah.
And he mentioned quite explicitly. So you'd assume that there will be a bit more tahrir of that. But despite that, he doesn't. I didn't see him use the usul anywhere.
Okay.
So even though he's mentioned it here, in the first volume at least, I didn't see him say Sa'ul Hakim wa Wafaqa al-Dhahabi.
Okay.
It might be more in the second volume, I didn't see it, but in the first one, I saw him cite Hakim a few times, but I didn't see him mention the Muwafaqa.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then that's fair. In terms of beyond the ahadith now.
Just one last point on
okay,
the hadith, right? Because I think I don't want to miss this one out. There's a back to the issue of the Masanid of Abu Hanifah again, right?
Yeah.
Is that he does many times he cite a few times, not many times, 3-4 times I think I've seen it, or twice at least. He mentions that he will cite the Musnad of Al-Haskafi. That's it. He'll say it comes to the Musnad Haskafi and also the Musnad of al-Harithi. Or he just sometimes in one place he just cites Haskafi, doesn't mention al-Harithi. What's important to mention, I've noticed this in my book that I've written on this topic, is that Haskafi's Musnad is a secondary source. It's not a primary source. Because what he does is he does ikhtisar of the Musnad of al-Harithi. And he also adds in some narration of Ibn Khusraw's Musnad as well. So it's a secondary source. And anything you find, you'll find the primary source anyway. So there's no need to
separate them.
Yeah, so you don't need to mention them separately. And sometimes they come in just the Haskafi is mentioned, not the other one.
Yeah.
And there's one instance that I found as well where he cites to the Muslim Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani. I've got the reference here, and he doesn't actually. It's not actually in there. That's just that's like probably a slight mistake of nothing major, right?
Yeah.
That's the minor stuff that happens in any book. So this is, by the way, just the source of what I've just mentioned here. One is I looked at it myself, compared parts, and it shows this. But then this is something mentioned by Abu al-Wafa al-Afghani. He wrote a letter to Molana Abdul Rashid Nu'mani, and he actually mentions this point, saying that Haskafi's Musnad, what exactly it is. Right? It's not a primary source, it's a mukhtasar of those, and he basically takes the Asanid off and starts the Hadith of Abu Hanifah. Right? So it's not a primary source as such.
Okay.
Okay, go on.
So, sorry about that. So the Ahadith we've discussed in a bit of detail now. The book also has an additional part to it, which is the author, Mullah Yusuf, he decides to put something called Fawaid. He'll title it Fa'ida, and he'll say kada wa kada, right? Or he'll say Fawaid, and then he'll mention certain masail. Now, we've already mentioned that this book is not a book of the madhab. It's not a book in terms of trying to explain the fiqh. He's just bringing the hadith and doing takhrij and mentioning sometimes the daraj of the hadith.
Yeah.
So this fa'idah, what does he try to do here? What is his intended, or comes through his writings here?
Yeah, so the fawaid, this is why reviewing becomes, it's not an easy book to kind of summarize, because there's so much going on. The fa'idah could be anything.
Yeah.
Right? The fa'idah could be a masla on fiqh, it could be a rawi, it could be there's footnotes about history of a name or dabt or something, right? And one of the benefits of the book is that so he kind of, in the second volume at the end, he has a section where he highlights all his fawaid, and where you can basically locate it.
That's cool.
And these fawaid vary. Some of these fawaid, which are basically other scholars have found that he cites. So for example, like a lot of the titles of the books, he uses Shaykh Hatim's book, al-Ulman al-Sahih. And then there's some fa'idas which he himself is this is his tahqiq. So you find both of them. But they vary in great degree, as I said. In terms of this, because we say it's not a Dalail al-Madhab book, I think that's why sometimes, and I saw some people speaking about the book, meaning about it coming out, they said this is going to be a book of defending some of the Hadith of Hidayah that no one's found before. To be fair, or to be honest to what the book's about, in many instances, the madhab is not something defended. I think, I haven't calculated how much it is, right? But a lot of the times, the tarjih of contrary to the madhab is mentioned.
Yes.
And this is important to know, is that when it comes to hadith, with the Hanafi scholars, you have certain scholars, especially in the last 100 years or so, the likes of Imam Zayd al-Kawthari, Shaykh Mufattah Abu Ghudda, Molana Zafar Ahmad Uthmani. You can add a lot of other scholars here, right? Where they basically take it, that's in I'la Sunan,
Yeah.
they take an approach to hadith through like Hanafi lens. And so what they would do is like certain usul or certain things, they would not agree with the muhaddithin. They would take the stance of either those muhaddith that coincide with the Hanafis or like a Hanafi type of take on it. So I'll give you an example, right? So you have stances like the Mursal of Nakha'i.
Yeah.
Do we accept it or not? So we know some muhaddithin tasheeh of it, others didn't. Hanafis, because of Nakha'i, they'll say the Mursalat of Nakha'i are sahih.
Yeah.
And I know any Hanafis that disagree with that. The other type of Hanafi scholars which are much more hadith oriented is like Sheikh Yunus Jaunpuri. And Sheikh Yunus Jaunpuri, rahimahullah, is from the mashayikh of the author.
Yeah.
Right? Mullah Yusuf and his father is from the mashayikh of them. And in every instance they cite from the Shaykh, they tend to agree with him. Any meaningful citation, they tend to agree with him. And that, for example, Sheikh Yunus' view on the Mursal Nakha'i is that it's not something which is authentic. It should not be used rather on itself. The author agrees. And there's many places throughout, because he's got a separate book where he kind of cites from, it's not published, but he talks about the positions of Sheikh Yunus. So a lot of the fawaid, and whenever he mentions like Sheikh Yunus's position, it tends to be against the madhab.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of these examples of citations which are, opinions that are advocated which are against the madhab. The only downside to this, I think, is like, I'll give you one example. I'll give you two examples actually to demonstrate this issue, right? You have the example of the mas'ala of khutbah, praying Tahiyyat al-Masjid when the Imam is doing khutbah. This is volume 1, page 538.
Yeah.
So, what volume is this? Volume 2, sorry. So, volume 1, page 538. And in this, he cites the hadith of, which Marginani cites. He says that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, إِذَا خَرَجَ الْإِمَامُ فَلَا صَلَاةَ وَلَا كَلَامَ. When the Imam comes out, there's no salah, there's no speech. No one discusses. And so then he mentions what everyone said and he concludes that the hadith is weak. Right? So he goes, فَالْحَاصِلْ أَنَّ مَا ذَكَرَ الْمَرْغِنَانِ رُوِيَ مِنْ حَدِيثِ ابْنِ عُمَرَ مَرْفُوعًا لَكِنَّهُ ضَعِيفٌ غَيْرَ مُحْتَجْ بِهِ. So the hadith that he cited is weak, or Ibn Umar, and it's not used as an evidence. Great. Then you have the fa'idah. And the fa'idah is في تحية المسجد وإجابة الأذان الثاني يوم الجمعة. So 2 mas'las, right? So let's take this to the first mas'ala about تحية المسجد and تحية المسجid when the Imam is praying, when the Imam is doing khutbah. So he goes, I wrote in my book, and this is his book that he wrote where he collects the tafarrudat, the unique positions of Shaykh Yunus, which usually go against the madhab. He goes, Shaykh Yunus, so he starts with Shah Waliullah, Molana Shabir Ahmad Usmani, and Shaykh Yunus, they all take the position of the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis that if the Imam is praying salah, so you're doing khutbah, sorry, you can pray, you pray 2 rakat, Tahiyat al-Masjid, you're meant to pray that. So he goes, and then he cites from Shaykh Yunus his conclusion by saying why. He goes, these evidences I mentioned, there's specific occurrences which suggest that someone didn't pray, for example, right? I assume this is what he's saying. He goes, this does not negate the sunniyah of praying Tahiyat al-Masjid. So he goes, the evidence that the Hanafis have cited, they're not enough to go against the sunniyah of it. And then he concludes by saying the more correct method is to pray Tahiyat al-Masjid. Now there's 2, like I say, two mulahadat on this issue, mulahadahs on this issue. Number 1 is that if I'm a reader of this, the only evidence I've been given of the Hanafi stance here is a da'if hadith.
Yeah.
Right? It's a da'if hadith. So I'm like, okay, Hanafi stance is da'if, and then I'll give a tarjih of Shaykh Yunus and these 2 other scholars.
Yeah.
That's not, so the thing with fa'idah is that there has to be consistency, right? You don't say, well, my purpose wasn't to give it, it's fine. Yeah. But if I'm my personal way would be like, if I'm going to go against the madhab or do tarjih, I would want to cite the best evidences for them and say, look, this is where you want to look at the full evidence for their position. I disagree and this is my reason for it.
It does give the impression that the hadith of Imam Marghinani's Hidayah is the main evidence. Exactly.
And if you were to actually go back to some of his references, so when you look at Fathul Mulhim, where he cites, it's the second problem now. In Fathul Mulhim, by the way, he goes through the evidences of both.
Yeah.
Right? And he actually shows the Hanafi evidence for why they don't pray Tahiyat al-Masjid and the other position. He concludes, because although he says rajjaha, right? But in the actual Fathul Mulhim, what I found, Allah knows best, because I've seen the passage that I may be referring to, I don't think it says what I think he's saying. I'm open for correction here. But what he does say, Molana Shabir Usmani, is as follows. He goes, after bringing all the evidence, he goes, هذا غاية السعي في هذا المقام. This is this is my effort.
Yeah.
I've gone to what I could present for both arguments.
Reach the limit.
He goes, والإنصاف أن الصدر لم ينشرح لترجيح أحد الجانبين إلى الآن. So I'm not too, so my chest is not open up to giving preference to one of the 2 positions. So I'm not too sure where the tarjih of citation of Usmani comes from. Allah knows best, but I went to it's the same edition as well, so I looked it up. That's what I found there.
Yeah.
Right, so Allah knows best unless I misread something, but this is what I found there. So I think these type of presentations are, like in the fa'idah, I think it's a bit of an issue.
Yeah.
The second example, which is also problematic, and I'm not going to cite it, there's volume 1, page 368, is that he talks about the mas'ala of, so he brings the Hanafi stance, so the hadith is not Hanafi stance, but the hadith that Marghinani uses for the minimum days of tuhar.
Yeah.
And then he brings a fa'idah, and the fa'idah is that Allama Kashmiri, he states that there is, this is Shaykh Yunus' position as well, and his mother's position. Because they say there's no minimum day for hayd, no maximum day for hayd. And there's no minimum day for tuhar as well.
Yeah.
It's all urf based.
Which is very significant.
That's a radical difference.
Yeah.
Right? So again, if you want to hold these positions, you can hold what position you want, right?
Yeah.
But I think the tahrir is required. Like, okay, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Again, I know you can say, but it's just a fa'idah. I get that, right? But if you're going to start putting these kind of fawaid in there, and say this is what we give fatwa by, the mother gives fatwa, I think she gives fatwa on this, it would be nice for us as a person to say, okay, can you show us the implication of this then? What's the implication? What exactly are you suggesting here?
Or at least refer to where the tahrir of the mas'ala is done in detail.
But there isn't, because Allama Kashmir is doing this out of his Bukhari dars.
Passing comment.
Yeah. So we don't know what his fatwa. He mentioned his Banuri as well. Again, Banuri Town's fatwa there. I don't know if they differ in this. It would be interesting to see if Banuri Town's fatwa, when Banuri was there, did he give fatwa on this? I don't know. These are tahrir that will be required in these kind of especially radical changes.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why with fawaid, I get it. But a lot of the times I don't think it does an accurate presentation of the mas'ala.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the thing with fawaid. There's no rules with it. Fawaid is just whatever fawaid you want to bring, right?
I think
There's some of the stuff that you found as well. Though.
yeah. So I think a couple of things as well. I mean, there was a point that he mentioned, a fa'idah, sticking to this, a fa'idah he mentioned regarding the changing of the qibla from Bayt al-Maqdis to Makkah al-Mukarramah to the Kaaba. And he mentions a point, tries to discredit Waqidi heavily, mentions a whole passage in the Hashia about that. But that's not the main part here. He tries to prove that the tahweel of the qibla happened at night. And he cites the Hadith of Bukhari, which mentions that the Rawi mentioned, or the Rawi mentions that the person who conveyed the news to the people of Quba said that the Quran has been revealed to the Prophet ﷺ during the night, al-Layla, which is the wording that's used, and then he told them to change the Qibla, and they changed, and that was in the morning. I was in the morning time for Fajr Salah. So he tries to prove from that this happened at night. Now he doesn't go into discussion about this, because the majority of the historians, or many historians, have mentioned that this happened actually during the middle of the day, whether you want to take the other riwayah of Bukhari, which the author doesn't mention, which is the hadith of Bara ibn Azib radiyallahu an, in Kitab al-Iman, which mentions that the first salah that the Prophet ﷺ prayed was Asr Salah towards the Kaaba. So that shows that it couldn't have been Fajr, or it couldn't have been before Fajr, because that would have mean the Prophet ﷺ had missed Fajr and Dhuhr. Trying to figure out what's going on. No, the first salah he prayed was Asr. That means that the news, the revelation must have come down either at Dhuhr time or after Dhuhr, after having prayed Dhuhr. And that's also strengthened by the riwayah of Nasa'i, where Abu Sa'id ibn al-Mu'alla, he mentions that the Prophet ﷺ, he stood up on the minbar, gave a khutbah, told the people that the Kaaba has been changed. Then he descended, and Abu Sa'id ibn al-Mu'alla, he actually said that I told my companion, let's pray 2 rak'at, so we can be the first people to pray towards the Kaaba. So he prayed 2 rak'at, and then the Prophet ﷺ prayed Dhuhr. So that shows that it couldn't have been Fajr. And then the historians like Ibn Kathir rahimahullah and Imam Qurtubi in his tafsir as well, they mentioned that the news that reached the people of Quba was in the following day. So the Fajr of the following day is when the person came and told the people of Quba that the Qibla has been changed, so turn around, and then they fastadaru and they changed around. So that was a point. He didn't explain it, but it would be interesting to see how he justifies his position.
Required in that.
Yeah. And I think the other one, I think a positive that's come out that I found for myself anyway, is that in some certain places he is able to identify where the mistake in the transmission comes, where he's able to identify that, okay, this kalam is mudraj, and he's able to say, okay, it was come from this specific author. And it came in the place of where you have to face all of your limbs towards the Qibla. And he mentions there that from, I think it was Ibn al-Qurashi mentions a certain statement, and then all the authors after him assume that that's part of the hadith. And he can track that timeline. And it's very useful for us then.
Yeah, we'll come back to the issue of istidrak right at the end, just as a final, just to kind of summarize the general point as well, inshallah. That's quite useful. Just one last point I want to mention about this, inshallah, is that because we mentioned about Ibn Abil Izz, and one of the books that he does cite from, but via al-Aini, and I think in the bibliography he does mention he's been using a manuscript of it, but maybe a bit more. Allah knows best, because I haven't got the which is Ghayatul Bayan of Amir Katib Atqani. And this book has been published recently, but there has been certain sections of it already available online. Right, and I think maybe ruju' to that may have been helped in certain situations. One example I found, because I didn't do any intense reading, right, just some stuff that I found which I thought may be useful, is that in volume 2, page 603, in the chapter of Diyat, right, he has a hadith that he brings from the Mukhtasar of Karhi, and he mentioned a note of this before, and this which is that Karhi's Mukhtasar. He starts off not mentioning a hadith, and at the end he starts mentioning a lot of hadith with his isnad. So he cites from Qasim Qutnubugha, who cites from the Mukhtasar al-Qarhi the following sanad, which he says, حدثنا الحروي قال حدثنا محمد قال حدثنا موسى بن داود, and he says معمر بن سليمان عن خسيف عن زياد بن أبي مريم. He brings the hadith, right? Then he says here, after the hadith, he goes, موسى بن داود صدوق فقيه زاهد له أوهام. Great. He goes, خسيف بن عبد الرحمن الجزري صدوق سيء الحفظ خلط بآخرة كذا في التقريب and al-Harawi wa Shaykh Muhammad lam aqif alayhima. So as for Harawi and his Shaykh, I did not come across them. Right? I did not come across them. He doesn't mention anything about this Ma'abun Sulaiman. But if you were to go to the part that's already been available online of Ghayat al-Bayan, or the same section, he actually brings the Sanad, because he cites from Karhi. This is before Qasim al-Qutb, right? He cites from the Sanad, the same Sanad from Muqtada Karhi, and he actually explains who some of the narrators are. So the Muhammad that he talks about, in page 214 of the, I'll give the details in a second. Page 214 of the, from Bab al-Qasama, this is from the, I think the Master PhD station, I'll cite it in a second. He says, he goes, حدثنا الحروي, same Sanad, right? قال حدثنا محمد بن الشجاع.
He's a different Muhammad.
Well, he doesn't know Muhammad it was, but in here it tells you what Muhammad al-Shuja' is now. So tafsil. And Musa ibn Dawood and Muammar ibn Sulaiman. And this is the student of who's done he published this, he mentions this, Muammar. So the two narrators goes, Harawi, the editor mentions, that this most likely is Abu Abdullah, Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Harawi, Sahib Muhammad al-Shuja'. And the Muhammad al-Shuja' is a famous Muhammad al-Shuja', he's discussed him in the book anyway. Right? And as for, when he says Ma'am Sulaiman, he goes, it's actually Muammar ibn Sulaiman. And this is معمر بضم الميم وفتح العين ثم ميم مشددة مفتوحة هو ابن سليمان الرقي يكنى بأبي عبد الله النخعي, right? And then he talks about وقول صالح, and he mentions some praise about him anyway. So I think that it would have been useful just to, as in, there's a lot of effort done in this book, right? Let's be clear, right? He's been using manuscripts, he's using a lot of works to maybe add to that, maybe because of the availability of Ghayat al-Bayan, or even what's available for the manuscript, or what some of the parts of it, would be useful to kind of use that. I think that would probably be more of a better source to use, because there's a lot of early references that's given in this book, which I see that later scholars have not necessarily.
That's the nature of publishing books right now. Books are being published so hard. But this
is available. This is available, right? So this is was done by Abdullah Usama Hassani Yusuf, right? In 2011.
Oh wow!
In 2011, and this is from the chapters of he did. This is a master dissertation he did. From what parts did he do it from? From Bab al-Qasama to the end of Bab Ma'akid.
Just to be clear, Ghayat al-Bayan is now available in its complete.
Now it's complete. I believe so.
Yeah, and I think,
and the manuscript is available online for a while as well.
I think even another author that Molana Shabir actually talks about is Imam Saruji in his al-Rayah. He says that hasn't been published, so it would be useful now to see what Imam.
But he does use a manuscript for it.
He does use a manuscript. Yeah. He does use a manuscript for it.
But yeah, so it's useful anyway. It's just some stuff that maybe we could, I'm sure the authors are already aware of and maybe using. But overall, in a nutshell, we mentioned a lot of points about the book. Does it do what it heads out to? Yes.
Yeah.
It's a very specific study. It's not a Dalal al-Madhab book, which you mentioned, right? There's a lot of fawaid in there. Some are mentioned from other books, some of his own. He's very meticulous. The publication, but is very nice, right? In terms of like the presentation, the indexing, everything is very nice.
It's good on the shelf.
No, it looks very nice. It's very nice, right? It's very thorough. You mentioned, right, to the book. But there are some points, and there's other things that I've noted as well, which are maybe not as significant, a bit more minor things, right? But these are some of the things that kind of stood out to me as I was reading them. Maybe in time other things will come to light, Allah knows best. But this is just our, some critical remarks that we want to give, but not taking away from the effort the author has made, which is very valuable insights that he gives.
Just to finish up now, because we've come up to our time limit and the man
and beyond, I think,
and beyond. The man in the hand camera is not happy. Just the final question now, because we've discussed this, right? And, we have position, we have ahadith in Hidayah. I think many people might be wondering this. There are ahadith in Hidayah which are not technically authentic, right? They're not classed as authentic. They're weak or etc. Now, how do students of the Hanafi madhab deal with this? Where you have positions cited in the Hanafi madhab by many ulama, and maybe even be the mu'tamad, the muftabihi, but are based on very weak, if not weak narrations that we receive criticism about.
Yeah. So this actually kind of one of the things that Mullah Yusuf does is the fact that some people may ask this question as well, is that how did this guy or some of us like we come now, how are we correcting the likes of Zayla'i, Ibn Hajar? How can you put my name or anyone's name today with these guys? Right? And that's what the author refers to as Abdul Da'if. He does his istidrak, Abdul Da'if does it, right? The weak servant, that's what he does it. So how does that work? How can someone like us in today's day and age be doing this kind of istidrak of these great scholars of the past? One of the reasons for this, and it kind of answers your question as well, is that a lot of the books that were not accessible to the authors in the past are accessible to us.
Mm-hmm.
And not only are they accessible to us, we can search through them.
Mm-hmm.
So now there could be a hadith in Hidayah. All I have to do, take those couple of keywords, put it on Maktaba Shamila or put it online, and I'll find references for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the books that's accessible now is Kitab al-Asl.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where a lot of the istidrak that he brings is from Kitab al-Asl, right? Which is also on Shamila, right? It's in Kitab al-Asl. And this is significant. So what he's doing is it's something which is necessary. And we've had it for a number of times. It's important people like him and others take on this job and make the maximum what's accessible to us right now. But when you go to Kitab al-Asl or these kind of books, you start to notice that the dalil may not be what Imam Marginani is citing.
Yeah.
And there's many examples of this, right? Like, for example, we may say, you open up Kitab al-Tahara, and then they say the khuruj min al-sabilayn is what breaks wudu.
Yeah.
Right? And then we say, to analogize where any najas exits the body breaks the wudu. So we've got a qiyas that we've done here. But someone can come along and say, and then Marginani might even cite a hadith to show that. That may not, Imam Abu Hanifah may have never thought of that hadith. He had this qiyas in mind.
Yes.
He brings the hadith. When we go and take a hadith orientated look at it and say, well, the hadith da'if, what are we going to do now?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or Imam Abu Hanifah may have cited Nakha'i. Nakha'i may have taken from the Ashab Abdullah Mas'ud. That was the reason why he took that position. But now Marginani, someone comes and cites a hadith, and you look at the hadith, it turns out to be mawdu'.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't affect the mas'ala unless it's something which is based upon the hadith, and we know Imam Hanifah used it.
Yeah.
And then, for example, you don't believe in it. So there are examples in this book, for example, where he turns around and goes, this is the hadith that Imam Abu Hanifah uses, or Imam Abu Muhammad uses, and I don't believe in it. I mean, the dalil is not strong.
Mm-hmm. And
he does it. He does ijtihad in essence. You can call it what you like. It's ijtihad, right? And then I'm sure many Hanifis were willing to come back and respond. What I'm saying is, a lot of the times, just because you find a narration to be weak, you have to first prove that this is what the madhab was based upon.
Yeah.
Not something that they picked out.
Yeah.
Right? Or they heard someone else mention it. If you can't do that, right, you can't demonstrate, that doesn't affect the madhab. That's just his evidence. It's like me coming today and I say, the Hanafis say this because of this reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I give my own rationale to it. You refuting my rationale doesn't affect the madhab's position.
Yeah.
Right?
Because I could have a different rationale.
Exactly.
Completely.
And just to highlight just a bit more on this istidrak issue, right? There's about 3-4 ways that why it's become much more easier and why we need to maximize, and these kind of books are very important and we need more people on board, is that there's a few things that we can do which a lot of scholars in the last 200-300 years couldn't do. One is the accessibility to books. So many books are available to us that people in the past didn't have access to. There's always the example I give is that, this must be about 50 years ago, 60 years, more than that now, 70 years ago, Molana Zeeshans, he wrote a book which is called, I think it's called Madkhal Usul al-Fiqh. So it's like an introduction to Usul al-Fiqh in Urdu. And I think the only book he had of classical Usul al-Fiqh was Al-Risala by Shafi'i, accessible to him, right? The rest of it, he had to use books like Kashf al-Dhunun to try to reconstruct what he thinks Usul al-Fiqh was like. So he goes, Jassas had a book called Fusul fi Usul. This guy, and I think this probably was because of this reason he wrote it. And you look at Jassas's life and you try to reconstruct how the origin of Usul al-Fiqh was. Now, Molana Zeeshans is an imam, major scholar. But I can come along now and say, well, I've got Fusul fi Usul. I don't have to buy it. I can Google it. It comes online.
Yeah.
So I can find out what it actually says when he was speculating. So a lot of the times, and not only that, like I said, so that's number one, right? So we have access to books that people didn't have access to before. We can search books easier than people couldn't search before.
Cross-reference.
Cross-reference, very easy.
Yeah.
Put your keywords in there, you find all the references that mention it.
Yeah.
So we got that. A third point people don't really consider as much, which is significant, and I found the author sometimes uses it as well, is that, for example, they may mention a hadith from a secondary source. This book has it. I think this, I forgot the book's name now, right? But they cite it from a book. And you go to that book and it's already been takhrij done of.
Yeah.
So the editor's done the job for you. So when you go there, you look at footnote, they tell you where the hadith is found already. So they've done the job for you. So these are reasons. And then number 4, of course, but and so what we can do now is much more easier, a chronological studies to see how developments take place.
Yeah.
The author does a very good job of where he looks, Sarakhsi said this, and then this guy came before, this guy came after. You can see how idea develops. We do fiqh all the time as well.
Yeah.
Those who do iftar course, they do all the time. They look at how ideas develop, right? It's much more easier. So all of these stuff together makes these kind of studies. So basically, we're living in a time where to do istidrak is ripe. Not because we're trying to, because put it this way, if our laptops were gone, our books were gone, we'd be nothing.
Yeah.
Right? We can't do any of the stuff they're doing, right?
We'd be relying on them.
Yeah, we're completely reliant on them, right? The internet goes and we're gone, right? That's all we're reliant so much on these kind of stuff. But The idea being is that we have so much here, so it's about maximizing that. And this is a good example of someone doing so.
Yeah.
Right? And even though despite our comments and stuff that we mentioned about certain aspects, these are like secondary points about aspects of the books that we disagree with, or things that could be improved on. But the general idea is something that I think a lot of students should be, getting into, because there's a lot of stuff you can do.
Yeah. Because there's a lot that
Exactly. And this has nothing to do with putting lower the maqam. Rather, I think you read it, you start to appreciate it. Think, how on earth did they do that without the accessibility that we have?
How did Ibn Hajar do what he did?
Exactly. How are you going to go take all your stuff away? How are you going to find these corrections? What were you doing all day to find these hadith?
Exactly.
Right? Like some of the stuff that I'm looking for, it took me a few minutes because I can just search stuff up. I was thinking, if I didn't have this, how would I be going through this? It would be a headache.
Yeah.
So you can imagine sometimes, the efforts of the scholars of the past. So it's nothing to do with this, but there's a open field right now that we can use the stuff in front of us to maximize.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on all of them.
We'll stop here.
أجمعين. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلوات والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Just as a note as well, I think we mentioned this last episode. Any corrections or any comments, anything, we're going to have an email. So you can email that into us as well, and we'll look at them and respond accordingly. Stay tuned for the next episode where we will be discussing. Have we sorted out? Yeah, we've got a few. We've got. Stay tuned. We'll announce it, inshallah.
Different stuff as well, by the way.
Different stuff. So it's not going to be all hadith. So if you're interested in other sciences,
English books as well. We have English books.
Yeah, we have English books, but if other sciences will be involved as well. So if you're not too keen on hadith stuff and you find it dry, then we've got aqeedah and stuff coming up as well, inshallah. So, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.